The series of exploring various different countries across the world. Today we are going to speak about the country Zimbabwe. Very interesting. I don't think many videos per se have been recorded with regards to the history of this country, and a lot will actually take place with regards to Jewish community. We're going to delve into the Sephardic history. So the history of the Jews of Zimbabwe actually reaches back over more than a century ago. I think present-day Zimbabwe was formerly known as Southern Rhodesia. Some always spoken about before, and later as Rhodesia. The community would peak in 1961 and with as many as 7,060 people at that stage in time. So I think it was mostly during the 19th century, more the Ashkenazic Jewish community would actually come from the Russian Empire and of Ukraine, Polish, Russia, and Belarus, Lithuania, and they would settle in Rhodesia. And after the area had been colonized by the British, it happened to have been, and it would become active in the trading industry. I think it was in the year 1894 the first synagogue was established. Apparently it was in a tent in an area called Bulawayo, if I'm not mistaken. And the second community was then developed in Salisbury, later renamed Herrera, if I'm not mistaken. We'll speak about that in due course. In 1895, a third Kahila congregation was established in Guelo. And come what 1901, or by 1900, there was approximately about 300 Jewish. Come with 1930s, that will be the point in time when Jews, Sephardic Jews, would arrive in Rhodesia from the Greek island of Rhodes. Now, we've spoken about it on various occasions before. We recorded a video on the history of the rabbinical seminary, I think, of Rhodes, of yesteryear. And many of them would actually settle in Salisbury. This was followed by more waves, I think, in the 1960s, when Jews would flee the Belgian Congo, and a Sephardic Jewish community synagogue was established in Salisbury in 1960s, 1950s, if I'm not mistaken. So it's actually interesting. I think towards the end of the 1930s, there were a lot of German Jews that were fleeing Nazi persecution, and they would go on to settle in the colony. 1943, the Rhodesian Zionistic Council and the Rhodesian Jewish Board of Deputies was established, and later they were renamed the Central African Zionist Council and the Central African Board. 6 a year after the horrors of the Jewish Kingdom, and come what 19 would actually peak at 7,060 people. And both Orthodox and progressive, let's say, congregations will emerge. The Bulawayo Progressive Congregation was founded by someone named Moses Cyrus Weiler. This was in the year 1958. And it was led by Rabbi Curtis Cassell. I think he came from the West London synagogue over there. This was between the years 1957 to 1977 for 20 years. And both the Progressive and Orthodox congregation, the Bulawayo Hebrew congregation, would merge in 1977. Interesting enough. So it's interesting. It was in the first half of the 20th century. Unfortunately, there was a high level of assimilation by Rhodesian Jews into Rhodesian society. Obviously, that's we don't want any assimilation whatsoever. And intermarriage rates were, let's say, at a very, very big high. Someone named Roy Welensky, he was the second and the last prime minister of the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland, was the son of a specific Lithuanian Jewish person, father, and an Afrikaner mother, apparently. And by 1957, 1 out of every 7 Jews who married in Rhodesia married a Gentile. So it was already nearly about 13-14% the intermarriage rate in of itself. So that's obviously not something to be celebrated at all over here. I think it was, in addition, the Rhodesian Zionist Council and the Rhodesian Jewish Board of Deputies, the Jewish community, they developed institutions to serve and strengthen the community, including 2 Jewish day schools. One was in Herrera, called the Sharon School, and one in Bulawayo, called the Carmel School. And there were community centres, Jewish cemeteries, Zionistic youth movements, Jewish-owned sports clubs, Savion Old Age Home in Bulawayo, going on in of itself in live welcome to our community. We're exploring the Jewish community history of Zimbabwe, so please, if you're on the channel now, subscribe to our channel and join. We're nearing 9,000 subscribers and we've got phenomenal content on here. Okay, we're going to let's say, additions to the Rhodesian Zionist Council and the Rhodesian Jewish Board of Deputies, the Jewish community developed institutions, let's say, that will serve and strengthen the community, including 2 Jewish day schools, one in Herrera, it was actually called the Sharon School, and one in Bulawayo called the Carmel School. And the community centres with Jewish cemeteries, there's Zionist youth movements, the Jewish-owned sports clubs, a Savion old age home over there in Bulawayo, and various different women organisations also come about. And there was a number of Jews from Zionist youth movements that would emigrate to Israel. So there was an emigration influx from Zimbabwe also to Israel, which is very, very interesting. I think it was in 1965, let's say, just reading this from the Wikipedia website, the white minority government of southern Rhodesia under the Prime Minister at the time, someone named Ian Smith, unilaterally declared independence as Rhodesia, and in response to British demands that let's say the colony be handed over, let's say, to the black majority rule, Rhodesia was then subject to international sanctions, and black nationalistic organisations began an insurgency known as the Rhodesian Bush War, which would last until 1979, when the Rhodesian government agreed to settle with the black nationalists. And by the time the Rhodesian Bush War, let's say, ended in 1979, most of the country's Jewish population had immigrated, along with many other whites. We have to point that out over there. I think some Jewish people chose to stay behind when the country was transferred, let's say, to black majority rule and renamed Zimbabwe. This was in the year 1860. The renaming will come. However, I think there was immigration would continue, and come what the year, I think it was 1987, only 1,200 Jews, let's say, out of the original population of 7,000 would remain. So it was very, very small. Most Rhodesian Jewish people immigrated to Israel or South Africa. There was better economic conditions over there, and Jewish marriage prospects also. They didn't want the trails and tribulations of potentially marrying out. Until the late 1990s, rabbis resided in Herrera and the Bulawayo area, but I think left as economy and community will begin to decline. I think today there is no resident rabbi, there's a traveling rabbi, which we'll speak about in due course over here. So that's something we have to point out over there. I think it was in 1992, there was a President, Robert Mugabe, let's say, at that point in time, will cause upset, let's say, to the Jewish community in Zimbabwe, when he remarked that white commercial farmers are hard-hearted people. You would think they were Jews. That's what he said. So you can see an anti-Semitic charged comment over there within regards to that. In 2002, the Jewish community's survival was threatened. I think there was a food shortage, and there was unfortunately poverty in the country. The mayor of Ashkelon at the time, obviously a southern area in Israel, a place we visited for, invited Zimbabwean Jews to immigrate to Israel and would offer assistance in settling in Ashkelon. I think several Zimbabweans will actually accept this offer. Then come with the year 2003, I think it was Bulawayo synagogue was burned down, and the small community did not restore the building. I think tefillot prayers were generally held at the Sinai Hall, the Savion Lodge in Bulawayo. Now I think in Herrera, the Sephardic community would have its own synagogue, and Ashkenazi had a separate synagogue. Today, because of small numbers of congregants, the prayers alternate between the two synagogues, so to make sure, because of million reasons. I think there's about 200 Jews in Zimbabwe today, in an area of Herrera and Bulawayo, and there are no Jews remaining in Kwekwe, in Gwiru, and in Kadoma. I think 2/3 of Zimbabwean Jews are over 65 years of age. The last bar mitzvah took place all the way back in 2006, so you can see the Jewish community over there is very, very much, let's just say, aging dramatically. Let's explore the census over here of the Jewish community. In 1894, there was only about 20 Jews in Zimbabwe. The community would grow to 300 in 1900. 1921, 1,289. 1936, 2,219. 1947, just after the Holocaust, 2,021. 1951, the census said 4,760. It would peak In 1961 to 7,061. In the 1970s, it would actually peak even further to 7,500. In 1970s, it will become, if I'm not mistaken, 7,500. In 1980, it will be 1,550. 1987, the census is 1,200.
Do you have pumpkin muffins?
1989, the population will be 1,168. In 2001, 800. In 2004, it will be 400. And then it will really dwindle. I think it did increase a little bit since 2019 to 200, if I'm not mistaken.
Do you have one pumpkin muffin, please?
Okay, everyone, we are exploring the Jewish community history here of Zimbabwe over here. So very, very interesting. Let's speak about the Lemba people. Who's the Lemba people? They speak the Bantu languages, which are spoken by their geographic neighbors and resemble, let's say, them physically. But they have some religious practices, let's just say, in itself, and beliefs similar to both Judaism and Islam. That's what's reported over. I think they claim, let's say, it was transmitted by oral tradition. They have a tradition of ancient Jewish or South Arabian descent through their male line, if I'm not mistaken. And I think genetic Y-DNA analysis in 2000s have established a partially Middle Eastern origin for a portion of the male Lemba, let's just say, population. I think more recent research argues that DNA studies don't support claims for a specific Jewish genetic heritage, as I say, in its own right. Now remember, we have to stress out, even if they have Jewish heritage, if they married a non-Jewish woman, halakhically the children are not Jewish. You have to point that out through Orthodox Jewish lens. Okay. Anyone tuning in live, we're exploring the Jewish community history of Zimbabwe. Now let's explore a few of the interesting personalities. We said before that there was a very rich Sephardic community in Zimbabwe of yesteryear. So let's speak a bit about that over there. Different personalities. I'm taking from an article from the ZJC.org.il website, which has short biographies. I don't know how detailed these biographies were, if they were completed. It's just a short snippet. You know, it was probably written at a time period when the personalities were alive, so I might not be able to state the history of their achievements, what they achieved after this article, or so on and so forth. They're very, very brief articles, just exploring who some of the people were, to just get a feel of the community in itself during the 1900s. I was a very well-known man named Isaac Menashe, or nicknamed Zach Menashe, and he was born in Salisbury on 8th of June 1926, and let's see, just like his contemporaries in the community, apparently the place of learning was a Prince Edward School. And from his youth, he would show, let's say, very keen enthusiasm on Jewish affairs over there. He was active in youth communities and was a bar coach of Habonim for several years. And Zach was, let's say, very well known as a sportsman also. Cricket, I think, is very, very popular in Zimbabwe in its own right. And let's just say he put sterling service on the congregation's committee and was a president, I believe, for several years between 1977 and 1978. I'm not too sure if he was continued his presidency, if the article of here which I'm reading would actually stop at that point in time. So another famous person in Zimbabwe was someone named Bobby Benatar, was the son of a founder member of the congregation, the late Jacob S. Benatar, if I'm not mistaken. Now Bobby apparently was also born in 1926, also once again attended the Prince Edward School. 1949 he would become, I think, the part of his father's business, and was the first chairman of the Sephardi Benevolent and Cultural Youth Society when it was opened in 1948. And he was assistant secretary of the congregation's committee and served on many, many committees, and I think was the president of the committee afterwards. Probably achieved more achievements also, but the article was dated at that point in time when so we don't know. I can't really trace the achievements he would achieve after this article was written over here. Let's explore more people. There was someone named Maurice Mizrahi, was a pillar of the community also. He was also Zimbabwe born, I think in 1930 in Salisbury. Once again, just like many others, he would learn in the Prince Edward School. Apparently he won a Bates Senior Scholarship. He would be graduating from Cape Town University, and he would join his father's successful business, and shown, let's just say, great interest in communal affairs. He was a community man, And I think he would be. I think in 1979 he would go on to serve as president of the congregation. I'm sure he achieved much more afterwards. I don't know on hand various other achievements that he will achieve afterwards. We have to point out, because I'm reading here from an older article from the Zimbabwean Jewish community website, and I think it was written actually seemingly towards early 1980s or late 1970s. So at the peak of these successful men. So I'm just stating some of the achievements they achieved at the time of the article, and I'm sure in many cases there were many more achievements. Hans Vandenberg was another one. I'm actually a personal friend of his son, who was rabbi in various pulpits all over the United Kingdom and Hong Kong. Some of Hans Vandenberg was, I think, actually born in the Netherlands, came from descended from great rabbonim, we have to point out, including from Rabbi Solomon Pereira Rodriguez Pereira, I have to get his name correctly, and a line of Dutch rabbonim. So Hans was a very successful man, I think, in textile business. He was born in Holland. I think he would actually immigrate to England and return to Holland during the war. Unfortunately, he was a prisoner of the Germans from 1943 to 1945. After the war, I think in 1948, he would come to Rhodesia. He would live in Umtali, I think, for the first 3 years, and then later in Salisbury. And he was elected the treasurer of the congregation in 1961, holding the position in 1972 for a period of 11 years. He was then elected the vice president of the congregation for 2 consecutive years, and in 1974 he would serve as the president. And once again, this article was written at the end of the 1970s, so he would go on to achieve various other great achievements after this article was written. Another famous man, Saul Nessim Al-Hadef. I think he would come to the country in 1932, join his brother Jacques Al-Hadef, if I'm not mistaken, and would have, let's say, an huge active interest in the affairs of the community, serving the community for many years. He was elected the president in 1940, and I think again he would be elected in the year 1945 as president. Now, another famous man in the country was someone named Dr. Benjamin Rodetti. Well, I think we're speaking about more of the Sephardic achievers in Zimbabwe at the time. There were more afterwards also, I have to point out. Interesting, Dr. Rodetti was actually born in Izmir, I think in 1910, on the 25th of April, and would emigrate to England. He would have an education, a good education, graduate with an MD at the Manchester University, and would practice in England until 1948. Eventually would come to Rhodesia and would come, let's say, very much into the community affairs, and would once again serve as the president in 1959, we have to point out over here. So very, very interesting. Anyone tuning in live, we are exploring Jewish community history and personalities of Zimbabwe. Another Sephardic personality in Zimbabwe was, who we just mentioned a minute ago, Jacques Nissim Al-Hadef. He was a president of the congregation for 3 non-consecutive years. He would serve as community in executive positions as vice president, a treasurer, a secretary, chairman of the Hebra Kadisha, and apparently he was honored with the congregation's first life award, that of honorary life treasurer over here. Jacques Nissim Al-Hadef was. Anyone tuning in live, welcome, and please subscribe to the channel. We are nearing 9,000 subscribers as we are exploring the history of the Jewish community of Zimbabwe over here on this special edition. Another pillar of the Sephardic community over there was someone, Mr. Soli Habib. He was born in Rhodes Island in 1908. He actually studied in Beirut, and I think would graduate in college in 1927. He immigrated to Rhodesia and would join his brother's business in Champa. And I think come the year 1931, he opened his own, concern in Philabusi, and would settle in Salisbury, I think in 1948, if I'm not mistaken. So that's very interesting. And soon after his arrival, he became an active member of the congregation. Okay, shalom everyone. We're exploring the Jewish community history of Zimbabwe. So we're speaking about Soli Habib. He was born in Rhodes Island in 1908. He would study in Beirut, and he would graduate from college in 1927. He emigrated to Rhodesia to join his brother's business in Shamba. Come up 1931, he would open his own, let's say, concern in Philabusi, and eventually would settle in Salisbury, I think in 1948. And he would become an active member, let's say, of the congregation's committee. He would serve as a president for 2 consecutive years in 1949 and 1950. And I think it was during this period, together with someone named I.R. Rosin, he was instrumental in purchasing the site on which the Sephardi Community Center had been built. Very interesting enough. So that's something else we have to point out within regards to him. We're exploring some of the famous Jewish personalities, Sephardic personalities now of Zimbabwe, of yesteryear. Nick al-Hadaf, another one. He would arrive in Rhodesia with his parents, I think in 1932. He was 9 years of age when he came, so he was born in 1923. He would study at the Prince Edward School once again, and later at Cape Town University. He would join the family business. Obviously, at the outset of the Second World War, he would join the army. On his return after military service, he became active in various spheres of Jewish affairs over there in the country. He would serve as a president of the Central African Jewish Board of Directors with the Central African Zionistic Organization Committee, and would serve 2 terms as president in 1970 to 1971. So that's very interesting. Now, another personality, Mr. Salvatore Al-Hadaf. So you can see the Al-Hadaf family is an integral part, family that really achieved a lot in Zimbabwe. He was actually born in Rhode Island in 1917. He would immigrate in 1937. He was about 20 years of age at the time. He would work initially in stores, I think in Ruzenza, for 24 months before, I think, moved to Salisbury. He would settle permanently over there, and he would be very keen, let's just say, interest in Jewish communal affairs over there and religious matters. He received religious training as a first student teacher at the Swade Israelite, and also was studied for 3 years at the Rabbinical College of Rhodes. So remember, we've spoken about the Rabbinical College of Rhodes. We did a special feature, a video on this at a previous stage here in this series over here. So something I have to point out. Let's say, upon the founding of the new congregation, I think he'd become the first Hebrew teacher over there, interesting enough. So he'd probably have a smicha, rabbinic ordination also. And lessons were conducted in his flat above the London bakery after working hours. As the community grew, so did his involvement with it. He would serve many years as a gabbai over there. He would serve as president of the community in the mid-1960s. Unfortunately, it reports over he was tragically killed in a major accident on the 1st of February 1970. So it'll be good to know more information about him. Salvatore Al-Hadaf was really, let's just say, seemingly he attended the famous Rhodes Rabbinical College also, so he was a rabbi also, seemingly, I would assume so. So if anyone has more information on him, if you're watching this video, I'd really appreciate it. Maybe we'll record a feature about him at one stage in time. I think that would be definitely a good idea to do that. Okay, another famous person was Henry S. Court. He was actually born in Poland in 1891. He emigrated to England as a child. I think in 1910 his family would move to Cape Town, and he would stay there and then would settle in Rhodesia at that point in time. He would arrive, I think, in 1926. He would become actively involved in Jewish matters. He had strong religious background over there and would actually be the chazan in the synagogue. And I think he was actually approached by the Sephardi community in his early years to give assistance. He will do it, and I think he was elected the second president of the congregation in 1932, and was also appointed the first marriage officer of the community, if I'm not mistaken. Very interesting. Now, another famous person, Mr. Behor Samuel Leon, MBE. He was born actually on the 2nd of November in 1889. Will come to Rhodesia in 1908 when he was young. He was a great benefactor of the Rhodesian community and was awarded an MBE for social services on the 1952 birthday honours list, and would serve the congregation as a president for 4 years. Another pillar of the community, another major figure in Zimbabwean history. Now, another famous man, someone named Behor David Al-Maleh. I think his son will actually give an excellent article which is featured on this Zimbabwean Jewish community website. So I'll read over what the article says about the famous man, about Behor David. He was born in Rhodes Island in 15th of September 1880. He died in Salisbury in 1979, the 3rd of February. So he was about 99 years of age when he passed away. We have to point out he was described as one of the best by his son, one of the best and loved, most honored men among his people. And this arose not from any, let's say, great deeds he achieved during his lifetime, but from, let's say, simple greatness and integrity. His son says, "My father did not have a formal education. His parents weren't so wealthy. However, they ensured that the Hebrew education was not lacking, and he attended various yeshivot on Rhodes Island." That's what's stated over. At the age of 14, however, he was forced to start work and, let's say, sail to Turkey, where he, I think, would become engaged in the produce business, if I'm not mistaken. From that early age, he would become the main breadwinner of his family. of 12. It was a big family, as his father was a cobbler and simply could not earn a sufficient enough amount, obviously, over there, because it was tough times everywhere. The turn of the century was, let's just say, the age of emigration. Young men were sailing from America and Africa. My father's brother-in-law, someone named Rahamim Hassan, came to Rhodesia and persuaded my father, this is what he says in the article, to follow him. He came in 1906, working at first in African trade in Umatali and later in an area called Penhalonga. I think in 1910 he returned to Rhodes to marry, obviously the son is saying the article, my mother, Raina Hassan, and a year later he brought her back to the colony. All the family were born in Rhodesia. Just before the First World War, my father and mother returned to Rhodes. But in 1990, my father returned on his own. He stayed for 6 years in the Penhalonga, building up his business until he was able to return to Europe and collect his family. Let's say this constant shuttling between Rhodes and Rhodesia was a necessary part of his life. There was so much, there was poverty, this is what the son describes, in the Mediterranean island, and the only way he could look after his father and his parents was to establish a business here in Africa and send money home. The article continues and says, if family life was disrupted, then it could not be helped. It was simply the lesser of two evils. Those early years was never easy for my father. As a boy in Turkey, he would trudge along country tracks, leading, let's say, a male often hiding to avoid brigands. Life in Africa was harsh too. When my oldest brother was born, both he and my mother fell sick with fever. My father had to, let's say, improvise a mashila to carry them both from the bush settlement at the Penhalgole into Umtali over rough, let's say, mountainous country. Between 1911 and 1913, my father brought 4 of his brothers to this country, 2 of whom, let's say, would look to America for their futures, let's say. And by 1920s, I think it was, as the article continues, I think it was by the 1920s, the article actually does go on over here, but unfortunately I don't have the rest of the article, but it's a big feature-length article over here, so I do apologize. It seems like he achieved a lot in his lifetime, I have to point out, but I don't have access to the rest of this article over here, but seemingly, just to confirm what his name was Mr. Bahor David Al-Maleh. He was a very successful man, and much more can be said about him. This article, I think, is featured on, to give you the website name so that you can search it, zjc.org.il under short biographies, and it really very much speaks about him in great detail. That's something I have to point out. Let's speak about a couple more rabbis over here. There was another famous rabbi, Rabbi Solomon Robert Ishai. Who was he? He was born in Tunisia in 1929. He was a student at the College des Garcons and the Talmud Torah. It's actually interesting. In 1953, he went to Lady Judith Montefiore College in Ramsgate. He would qualify in 1956 as a Hebrew teacher. I'd assume he'd have a rabbinic ordination. Yes, so he did. He was appointed minister in the Cheetham Hill Congregation in Manchester in 1965. In 1960, he was appointed associate minister with the Sephardi Hebrew Congregation in Rhodesia, and he was minister of the congregation from 1963 to 1968. And I think at the time of this article, he was a rabbi of the Orve Shalom Congregation in Atlanta, Georgia. Interesting enough, and I'm sure would go on to achieve many more achievements afterwards. So that's very interesting. Another rabbi that will make his mark in Zimbabwe. We haven't got much information on him because I think he was only about 30 years of age at the time of this article. Was somebody named Rabbi Isaac Ben Zaken. I don't know, it could be he's still alive at the moment. I have to find out more within regards to him. But in the early years of his life, we can, because this article is a very old article I'm reading from. He was born in Tangiers in Morocco, I think in 1946. He would study at Alliance Francaise, and in 1961 he immigrated with his family to Brazil, and he would study at the Montefiore College, Gated Yeshiva, and the Jens College in England. In 1968 he came to Salisbury. He was an assistant minister to Reverend Ishai, and in 1969 he was appointed minister of the congregation, and 2 years later he got married to Denise Lazarus, Rabbinate Denise Lazarus. His studies would continue from the rabbinate, and in 1973 he would take on a sabbatical leave to study at the Johannesburg Rabbinical College where he would obtain a smicha. And in June 1974, Rabbi Ben Zaken was inducted at the by the very Rav Chacham Dr. Solomon Gaon, the great rabbi. In of itself, he was a chief rabbi of the Spanish-Portuguese Jewish community in England, if I'm not mistaken. He remained with this specific committee, and then he would move his family to Brazil. Now, I'm not too sure what other great achievements he would have in his life, and this article is a very old one, so I'm just reading from the article, but he was only 30 years of age at that point in time, so I'd assume he'd go on to achieve much more. Now, another famous person, Robert Dr. Manfred Papo, PhD. So who was he? He was born actually in Vienna, Austria, in 17th of October 1898. He was son of Rabbi Michael and Rabbinit Laura Papo. Now, Dr. Papo graduated with a PhD at the University of Vienna in 1922 and was ordained a rabbi by the chief rabbinate of Yugoslavia in 1938. He was interned at the Doshi during the war, and after his liberation from the camps, he worked for the Sephardi community in Manchester. In 1944, Mr. Rosin, after interviewing Dr. Papo, recommended his appointment as the first minister of the Sephardi Hebrew congregation of Rhodesia, and he arrived in Salisbury in April 1944. He would serve the community as a rabbi. He was a Rosh Bet Din over there, head of Jewish court. He was the headmaster of the Sephardi Hebrew school over there also, I think from 1944 until his retirement in 1963, and I think he passed away on the 15th of May 1966. He had great appointments in of itself. I think between 1919 to 1925 he was an assistant minister of the Turkish Hebrew congregation in Vienna. Between 1928 to 1938 he was a professor in the Vienna State High Schools for Jewish religion. Between 1924 to 1944 he happened to have been acting honorary minister to the Whittington Congregation of Spanish-Portuguese Jews in Manchester, in England, and would have various different publications. 1932, Sharei Torah; 1933, Sharei Tefillah or Nivita; 1947 to 1948, the Sharei Limud, at different parts, I think, which were handwritten in of itself. Hopefully at one stage we'll record a video also within regards to him, within regards to our encyclopedia. Also, another famous man of the community of Zimbabwe was someone named Mr. Leon Ferreira. Who was he? He was a founder committee member. He was known as a grand old man, very, very famous. I think he was actually born, if I'm not mistaken, around the year 1893, if I'm not mistaken. It was, I think, in 1911, when he was 18 years of age. Mr. Leon Ferreira came to Rhodesia from Rhodes Island, and I think, very, very interesting. And I think his wife was Mrs. Matilda, if I'm not mistaken. And I think Leon Ferreira, let's just say, he writes actually an article over here, remembers, let's just say, in his article that his boat fare was £35 originally. He would sail through Suez to Beira and would catch a train to Salisbury. He would work for 2 years for BD Almaleh in a specific shop, I think, in a store in Penhalonga. He would earn a salary of £5 per month. No accommodation so much was provided, but the shop counter acted as a bed, and blankets were taken out to stock at night to sleep on and replaced in the morning. So you can see the Mesirat Nefesh people were doing those days to earn a living and to work. I think in 1920, Leon Ferreira would return to Rhodes Island, get married to Matilda Hassan. He and his new wife would then return to Rhodesia and, mutually took up business in the area called Mazoa. It was sold in the early 20s, and then they moved to Gatuma. Well, I think Mr. Leon started what is known as a Ferreira wholesalers. Always, he was a very conscious man. He assisted many relatives and friends to come to the country, including his nephew, the late Jack Ferreira, who came in 1924, initially working for Leon and later taking interest in the business. In 1941, Leon and his wife came to Salisbury, although the business continued to Gatuma. In 1946, the premises caught fire and was destroyed. But Leon Ferreira was always a hard-working man, ready to face most obstacles. The premises was rebuilt and the businesses flourished. At the end of World War II, his son Jackie returned from active service in Egypt, if I'm not mistaken. So that's very, very interesting. Now, the I.R. Rosin, he was another famous person. I think it was in 1970, R. Rosin, OBE. He was a man with distinguished professional career. I think he would be a surgeon also. He was made honorary life president of the Sephardic Hebrew congregation, and this was a great honor, a similar honor bestowed by the community in the main transplanted from Rhodes upon a man who could trace no ancestry to the island. He would have Kipps Rosin's influence upon the Sephardi community was an example, let's just say, of how out of sadness and perhaps a certain bitterness, good and powerful things may grow. I'm just reading this from the website. I think it was in 1935, Kipps Rosin became, at that point in time, he was part of the Salisbury Ashkenazi community, if I'm not mistaken, and I think that his father, I think, was Rabbi Joseph Julius Rosin, if I'm not mistaken, who would work, I think, in the congregation for 18 years. And I think he felt that he could not, so he was very much part of this community. And then I think he would later on join the Sephardic community, if I'm not mistaken. And very interesting. So he was also a pillar of I think he would attend the Whittington Sephardi synagogue. And he really saw, let's just say, the extensive warm hospitality by, let's say, the rabbis over there at that point in time. He would give, I think, a sermon at the High Festival, if I'm not mistaken. And I think for many years he would give over various different sermons in the congregation. Mr. Rosin would. And he was on the committee, if I'm not mistaken, and would become a president of the community afterwards. And his influence was felt. Let's just say, we'll just take a short break and continue speaking about Mr. Rosin. Shalom, everyone, sorry about that. We just took a short break. We're exploring the history of the Zimbabwe Jewish community. We're speaking about a famous man, Mr. Rosin, over here, who would be a pillar of the Sephardic community over there. He would give over sermons, if I'm not mistaken, and become the president of the community. He was highly influential in the congregation in itself, and much can be said. The community he would really help the community with regards to various different matters in of itself, and he was seen as an essential point, let's just say, within regards to the community, and had relations with various different other communities also, let's just say, and the connections we have to point out also. Okay, so now let's speak about another famous person over here of the Jewish community. There's someone named Raphael, who was Gabbai of that, Mr. Raphael Menashe, if I'm not mistaken. Let's say a word with regards to him. I think he was actually given a title of Honorary Life Gabbai, which was given to him by the committee, I think, in 1980. And Mr. Menashe had been a chazan and a minister, leading services in the kahila, and really running the burial ceremonies, and was always available, I think, on various different undertakings. I think he was actually born in the year 1911, and he would emigrate to Rhodesia in 1936, settling in Salisbury, where he would become a member of the congregation. He established himself as a merchant and part of the clothing manufacturer business. If I'm not mistaken, he would serve the committee and conducting religious services over there. And I think Rabbi Benzaken, while he was rabbi over there, he was absent. He would actually steady the ship during sabbatical leave and conduct services over there, and do various different bar mitzvahs, at least a dozen of them. I think in 1946 he got married to Mrs. Regina Hasson, who was a survivor of Auschwitz, and they would actually get married in Salisbury Street Synagogue, if I'm not mistaken. I think it was in 1979 he succeeded someone named Leon Mayo as a Gabbai to the congregation, and the following year the honorary life title was bestowed upon him. And throughout this period, let's just say, as Gabbai, R.J. Menashe was endeavored in all conductions of religious services, let's just say, and the greatness he would actually do for the community of itself. So he's now the key figure in the history of the Zimbabwe community, and he would achieve a lot more. I'm not sure when he passed away or not, but that's very, very interesting. Okay, let's speak about the choir of Zimbabwe, the Sephardic community. I think the choir was originally formed in 1946 under the guidance of Mr. Leonid Bersin and Mr. Savota Al-Hadef, who we mentioned about before. And the main members were the pupils of the Hebrew congregation. And the choir was used, I think, only in youth services, if I'm not mistaken. In 1947, someone named Mrs. Stella Al-Hadef, who had graduated as music teacher in Cape Town University, would join as a chair and would take charge of it. Under her guidance, there was the support of Rev Ishai, if I'm not mistaken, and Rabbi Ben Zaken. And the choir grew in strength in the early 1960s. Very interesting. More would take place over there. The use of the choir was used at weddings and various different festivals, was introduced and was seen as very successful. Membership of the choir became, let's say, greater at various points in time. And I think during the 1970s, it will dwindle at that point in time. I'm not too sure what will go on afterwards because this article was written, I think, right at the end of the 1970s, if I'm not mistaken. But they were still continuing to serve the community after points of time. There was a Sephardi Ladies Society in Zimbabwe, if I'm not mistaken. So we have to speak about that for a minute, which included people like Yvonne Kay, Doris Menashe, Becky Cricker, Eva Bondi, if I'm not mistaken, just among a few, Miss Dames, Elsie Al-Hadaf, Rachel Surmani, Miriam Surmani, Katie Dozetos, very interesting enough, and various other people. Now, I think this society itself was formed in the year 1954 and was often let's say unsung, but nevertheless a vital organisation which kept day-to-day running of the community, let's just say. So it was a very, very integral part of the community. The duties of ladies were to attend the upkeep of the synagogue, to visit Jewish patients in hospitals, raise funds for the congregation, and especially to cater for bar mitzvahs, weddings and the like. Over the years, the society did huge amounts of works in of itself. The first charity was elected, I think, in 1954, was someone named Mrs. I think her name was Amelie Benatar, if I'm not mistaken. We did speak about Mr. Benatar beforehand. I'm not sure if that was husband and wife, who would hold this position for 7 consecutive years. And I think Mrs. Sarah Shapiro would be a member of the society. And this committee itself was, before I mentioned a few of the people on the list in of its own right. There was a committee, the actual committee itself, a 1980 to 81 committee, included Raphael Menashe, the Honorary Life Gabbai, Albert Menashe, David Kay, Victor Al-Hadaf, Morris Mizraki, Isaac Menashe, Isaac Merjan, Neville Kodron, Al Naim, Mario Stegro, who was part of the Chevra Kedisha, if I'm not mistaken, Victor Sormani, Salvo Al-Maleh, Bobby Benatar, and Jerry Katzenberg, we have to point out also over here. Friends, anyone tuning in live, we're exploring the Jewish community history of Zimbabwe. Let's take a bit of on a bit of a tangent over here, and there's an excellent article from the Ish website titled Under African Skies, Jewish Life in Rhodesia. This was actually written quite recently, September 2025, by Vivian Calvaria, if I'm not mistaken. Once thriving, now nearly gone, the Jewish community of Rhodesia leaves behind echoes of faith. In the heart of South African, far from European shtetls and Mediterranean shores, a likely chapter of Jewish history would unfold. Rhodesia's sun-scorched plains, families who fled pogroms, let's just say persecution, war-forged a community that was once fragile and unshakable, and survival tested by fire, politics and exile. The Jewish community of Rhodesia, obviously Zimbabwe, was a mosaic of tradition and cultural richness. It was small in number, this is what the Ish.com website says, deeply rooted in faith, ancestry and kinship. This woman who's writing the article states, "My family was part of this fabric, one of many threads in the tapestry woven over generations by Jews who came from scattered homelands to build something lasting in southern Africa." The earliest Jewish settlers arrived in the 1800s, late time, mostly Ashkenazic Jews from Russia and Lithuania. They brought with them commitment to Jewish life, a love of learning, strong Zionist ideas. In towns like Bulawayo and Salisbury, they laid foundations of community life, building synagogues, Hebrew schools, youth movements, and communal organizations such as Rhodesian Jewish Board of Deputies and the Zionist Council in of itself. In 1930s, a wave of Sephardic Jews would arrive from Greek island of Rhodes. We just mentioned about some of these great personalities over there. They settled in Salisbury, bringing vibrant Ladino traditions, a distinctive cuisine like brocas, pastelikos, bizcochos, folk songs that pulse through community gatherings. Let's just say the German Jews would come, including her family, she says over here, fleeing the rise of Nazism in the 1930s. Many were professionals, lawyers, doctors, teachers who carried both trauma of their recent past and refinement of Central European Jewish culture. They integrated quickly, contributing to Rhodesia's intellectual and economic life. In the 1960s, as civil war broke out in the newly independent Congo, another wave of Jewish refugees would arrive. They would bring with them a hybrid identity, European roots, let's say filtered through dust and layered historical of post-colonial, let's say Africa, add new threads to already rich communal tapestry. Each group carried, let's say, the weight that they left behind, skills, traditions, stories. She says, the author of this article, my family owned and operated a successful dry cleaning business in Bulawayo. We serviced local hotels and the Rhodesian railways, washing and pressing linens for the couches, sleep wagons that carry travellers through the night to Mozambique or South Africa. Like so many others, they were part of the country's growing infrastructure, part of, the promise of flourished Jewish life. They belong to Zionistic movements, Habanim, Beitar, B'nai Akiva. Obviously, depending on the family's political leanings, let's just say in itself. This is what she says in the article. In 1965, there was a shift that would occur, a seismic shift. Rhodesia declared unilateral independence, which would result in global condemnation, economic sanctions, escalating tensions. By late 60s and the 70s, the one stable government environment would begin to unravel. Many Jewish families, uncertain about the country's future, began to leave. One by one, they would drift away to various places, South Africa, Israel, UK, Australia, the US, and would dwindle, and the streets were empty. In 1986, Author's family emigrated to Gainesville, Florida, joining a synagogue within the first week of their arrival, and it was instinctive, like seeking shelter. How comforting to walk into a sanctuary of 5,000 miles from home and hear the same melodies and recite the same prayers, the author says here in this article over here. And then, I'm not going to state over the whole article here, then just as we were beginning to rebuild our lives, we hear news from back home in Rhodesia. The historic Bulawayo synagogue was destroyed in a fire. And the author says, in a biblical twist of fate, the synagogue that was founded in 1894 caught fire just after Tisha B'Av, the day commemorating the destruction of first and second temples in Jerusalem. A burning hedge outside the ignited building. And members of the community rushed to the scene and stood by helplessly. Within minutes, the sanctuary was engulfed in flames, leaping in the skies. Suddenly, two men broke from the crowd, ignoring the firefighters' dire warnings, plunged into burning synagogue. Moments later, they emerged covered in soot, carrying all 6 Torah scrolls and a 300-year-old parochet from the Aron HaKodesh. The Siddurim and holy books were destroyed, but the synagogue's most sacred treasures were saved. Perhaps the most haunting image from that day was Rabbi Lazer Abrahamson, then 104 years old, standing beside the charred remains of the synagogue where he had officiated for decades. He clutched his cane with one hand, wiped away the tears with another, and asked broken-hearted what he would be buried in. His talit had been consumed by the flames. The congregation, I think, continues to function, holding services in temporary quarters. This is what the author says. But given the community's dwindling numbers and fragile finances, unlikely a new synagogue will rise from the ashes in a city that once boasted a Jewish population of 3,000 people. Only fewer than 70 remain, most of them elderly. This is what it says. The article continues, says, Carmel, the Jewish day school in Bulawayo, will still stands, but the students are no longer Jewish. Instead, children of all ethnicities attend, drawn by its reputation for academic excellence. They sing Hebrew songs, recite prayers in a language they don't understand, and unwittingly preserving fragments of once thriving Jewish community. The old age home houses a few remaining Jews who chose to stay as the world they once knew slips away. And very interesting. This article points out more things. Let's speak about the Bulawayo Hebrew congregation over here. This was a famous congregation. The Bulawayo Hebrew congregation was inaugurated in August the 12th, 1894. Reading once again from the zjc.org.il website. It was formed in 1894 as the first, white settlers established their homes. By 1895, the Jewish population numbered 94. Jewish marriage would take place, I think, between Mr. and Mrs. Jacobs. The congregation flourished over the years and grew to peak in the late 1960s of over 3,000. With a Jewish primary school, apparently there was a Reform synagogue there, a Jewish sports club, Parkview, and organizations such as WISO, Habonim, Beitar, B'nai Akiva movements, and the CAZO, and more. And the Centenary magazine, would publish in 1994, would give a story of the congregation at that point in time. Then there was a Samuel Leon Sephardi Hebrew congregation. I think it was in May 1962. The Samuel Leon Sephardi Hebrew school was opened next to the Sephardi congregation of Sha'arei Shalom Synagogue in Salisbury, in Herrera. The school was named after the father of B.S. Leon, who was the main benefactor of the school. The first Hebrew teachers was Rabbi Dr. Papo and Reverend Ishay. In later years, the school became the Jewish nursery home And the original 8mm film was digitalized by someone named Mr. Isaac Menashe, I think we mentioned about before, and then edited by Dave Bloom and Isaac to show names of people, showing the film as best as possible. We have to point out over here. There was a Sharon School, which we spoke about also. I think Mervyn Lasovsky would actually be the one that will inaugurate it, if I'm not mistaken, over there. So very, very interesting. Let's speak about more famous Zimbabwean personalities over here, like we're on the topic over there. Let's go back. One of them was a famous man of name Mr. Joe Vandenberg. He passed away quite recently, on the 25th of April, 2024. So who was he? He passed away in Holland on the 25th of April. He was 77 years of age. He lived for almost 50 years of his life in Zimbabwe, where he was a chairman of the Harare Hebrew Congregation for 4 years and a president of the Harare Chamber of Industries for almost 4 years. In these two positions, he followed in the tradition of the Vandenberg, let's just say, of serving both the Jewish and wider communities, and indeed that of his father, Mr. Hans Vandenberg, who we mentioned about before, who had been the president and the treasurer of the Harare Sephardi Congregation, as well as the president of the Chamber of Industries. His mother, I think Mrs. Miriam, had also been active in the Sephardi Ladies Guild, which we spoke about before. Okay, Joe was born actually in, I believe, in Rotherham in England, actually in 1947, to Mr. Hans and Mrs. Miriam. His father had opened a carpet factory before the Second World War. 2 years later, the family moved to what was then Umtali, Rhodesia, where they established a jute mill over there. Come on, 1953, the family moved to Salisbury. They opened the Central African Weaving Mills, which would become the Lympha Mills in later years. Now, Joe would spend 50 years living in Rhodesia, which then obviously became Zimbabwe, and worked in several fields, including the family business, jewellery, pharmaceuticals, and would eventually establish his own business. Joe got married to Mrs. Arena Costa, I think, in 1983 in Holland, and brought his young bride to Zimbabwe at the time, where I think their firstborn, someone named Jeremy, was born, followed by Ronnie, who was born in Holland. And it's actually interesting, I think they actually studied in the same school as me, the sons did, in England, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And in 1997, Joe and his family moved to London, where Joe established another pharmaceutical business. In 2010, he retired to Holland, where he continued to be active in the Harlem Jewish community, as well as becoming a member of the European Jewish Parliament. So you can see various different accolades and positions he would get over. He would suffer from health challenges, reported over in this article, towards the end of, apparently in the first 2 years of his life. But he would lead a normal life at the end, thank God, and would take interest in, especially in theatre. He was a member of the Salisbury Repertory Theatre and featured in theatre productions. He won a television talent contest, if I'm not mistaken, and was extremely proud of his Jewish and Dutch heritage on both sides of the family. And it's actually interesting, we stated before in the previous video with regards to Rabbi Rabbi Salomon Rodriguez Perez, that they can actually, who was a great rabbi, also we did a video on, they trace their Dutch roots back to 16th and 17th centuries. And it's actually interesting, yeah. So we said that Mr. Joe's maternal grandfather had been Hacham, the Sephardi, the rabbi of the Holland, and the first Jewish military captain of the Dutch armed forces. And the Vandenberg family had been prominent both in Jewish and wider communities in Holland. And it's interesting. Very interesting. So I think at the time this article was written, he's got 3 grandchildren, Raphael, Eitan, and Mila, if I'm not mistaken. And maybe they say at the time of the article, I think it was written that another grandchild was due in June, if I'm not mistaken. I think referring to possibly either 2024, 2025. We have to point out that Mr. Joe, his brother was a rabbi in various places in the United Kingdom. Rabbi Dr. Martin Vandenberg would become a rabbi in Hong Kong, I think window of time, Bevis Marks Synagogue, one of the most famous synagogues in England, and Liverpool Synagogue also, and most famously Wembley United Synagogue, and received various different accolades and degrees and titles also, we have to point out. And I think that he had a sister also, Henrietta, if I'm not mistaken, also, that passed away, I think, in South Africa, if I'm not mistaken, also. Okay, so let's continue. Another famous person was Laser Abrahamson, if I'm not mistaken, and he was born, I think, in 1899 in Poland, actually, and he came out to Rhodesia and joined his brother Morris in a trading store in Bulawayo, I think in 1926. Very interesting enough. That was in 1926, and he was known as a very famous man, I think, in this specific area, someone that we should speak about also. So he was a key figure in that point in time. There was Rabbi Moshe Silberhaft, who I think Silberhaft of the American Jewish Congress and rabbi for the country's communities with Belaways. He was a key person. We'll speak about him in due course also. But this Levi Abrahamson was a pillar of the community also, we have to point out. A.I. Menashe, I think he passed away, he was 91 years of age, if I'm not mistaken. And I think he passed away, if I'm not mistaken, in the year 2002. He was, I think, past president of the Sephardi Hebrew congregation of Zimbabwe. And he was very much dedicated to the Jewish community in Zimbabwe. I think he moved to Israel in 1984, if I'm not mistaken. And that was obviously the dream of his. But beforehand, he was in Zimbabwe and the pillar of the community. He came to Zimbabwe from Rhodes in 1926 at the age of 15 and initially stayed in Kwekwe with his uncle Aaron Menashe, Albert's father, Isaac. I think died at an early age, sadly, and left behind a wife, Raina, and 5 sons. Raina had difficulty, let's just say, in raising the 5 boys on her own, and the eldest of whom was Albert, who at the time was only 11 years of age. When Albert arrived in Quetta, he was dispatched to school the very next day, and it says over here in this article, which I'm just reading over here, he did not remain at school long, as obviously there was economics of the day didn't permit such luxuries. It was difficult at that point in time, just financially. Albert initially worked for his uncle before settling up the first business at the age of 18. During his first years in Zimbabwe, Albert recalls earning a salary of 30 shillings a month, 20 of which he sent to his mother back in Rhodes, so he was really a caring person also. He got married to Mrs. Vida Menashe. They weren't related, apparently. They were not. Same family name, not related. In 1935, at the Specs Hotel in Kadoma, they would move to Harare in 1946 and would live in the rural suburb over there, and eventually moved to Milton Park in 1950. They had 4 children: Rennie, Sarah, Pearl, and Isaac, who was a famous person. Albert Isaac Menashe was known as A1 over here. Served as president of the Sephardi congregation in 1951, 1952, 1956, 1958, and 1960, 1963. It was known as the golden age of the Sephardi community, when the number of congregants was at the highest. A1 was instrumental in the establishment of the Shari Shalom Synagogue, the Rhodes Memorial Hall, and the Samuel Leon Hebrew School during this specific period. He also served as the treasurer of the congregation for many years and held titles of honorary life treasurer. A1 was involved in the activities of the Jewish community in Zimbabwe for over 40 years. Apart from his significant contribution to the Sephardi congregation, Albert was also very active in the Central African Zionist organization, CAZO. He was a chairman of CAZO's Israel Appeal campaign for 5 years. He was the CAZO treasurer for very many years. In 1982, he was elected as an honorary life president of the CAZO in recognition of his outstanding services to the Zionistic cause over there. Very interesting. He was given a Hebrew Order of David. He was a keen Mason, and through his association with the Masonry contributed to the community at large, and was active member of the Hebrew Order of David and served as a treasurer for several years. His wife, I think Vida, passed away in 1983, and they were married for 48 years. Albert would live in the Beit Avot Sephardi in Haifa for 11 years, and he's including among his children Sarah, Pearl, Isaac. They all live, I think at the time of this article, I'm not sure when it was written, many years ago, would live in Israel, and while Rene would live in Los Angeles. And all 4 children were together with Albert when he celebrated 90th birthday. I'm not sure, this was obviously many years ago this article was written. At that point in time, he had 9 grandchildren and 5 great-grandchildren. So we hope obviously that number has been enlarged also, and the whole family are healthy. So let's we're going to continue this video just in a minute time. We're going to take a short minute break and continue this presentation on the history of the Zimbabwean Jewish community history over here. So just wait and be patient. We're back in a minute over here. Thanks everyone for being patient. Over here we're exploring the Jewish community history here of Zimbabwe over here on this special edition over here, friends. Okay, let's talk. There's a nice article by Manfred J. Schwartz with regards to Rhodesian Jews, a history over there. We're not going to read the whole article, but part of it. Immediately after 1939 to 1945 world, a great wave of immigrants flooded the region, and northern Rhodes and Nyasaland beckoned many immigrants in its borders. More than half a century earlier, in 1889, someone named Cecil John Rhodes of De Beers diamond fame established almost as his own field farm the British South Africa Company, which wielded enormous influence in Africa. I think it was in 1923. The country was granted internal self-government, and in 1953 became the Federation of the two Rhodesians and Nyasaland. Okay. As a British Empire builder supreme, he advocated a string of British possessions stretching from Cape Colony to Egypt. Map adjacent, printed in red, would form the root of success in British imperialship. During the latter parts of 1800s, many settlers, including Jews of Eastern European origins, came to this paradise, let's say, and were instrumental in the development of the country. Later, many immigrated from the Boer republics, the Cape Colony, and Natal. In of itself, and the article continues to say that one Zederberg of Pittsburgh maintained a mail coach service. He was renowned for having teams of zebras drawing, let's say, the coaches. Thus, many would afford it, use coach service for the south, while others, let's say, via Mozambique and walk from the Beira in the Portuguese territory, and so on and so forth. And thus, interpreted treasurer settlers face hazards from wild animals, as well as debilitating diseases and shortage of adequate foods. And it's a whole article actually over here. Many Sephardic Jews from Greek island of Rhodes, famous for one of the ancient wonders of the world, the statue of Hellas in the Aegean Sea, came mainly to Salisbury, as I mentioned before. So the article says they would establish a synagogue in 1932 and kept to their own millennium-old customs and culture. Their prayer services obviously different to Ashkenazic ones, and the melodies obviously are different pronunciation of Hebrew vowels and consonants, and very, very interesting. Now, from ancient times, the Sephardic Jews have been more integrated into the local non-Jewish cultures, whereas Ashkenazic Jews, where Judaism flourished, there were greater tension between Christians and the Jews, and hence they tended to be isolated from their non-Jewish neighbors, either voluntary or involuntary. In Islamic lands, where Sephardic Judaism developed, no such segregation happened. Sephardic Jews taught thought and culture was strongly influenced by the Arabic and Greek philosophy and science over there. During the Spanish Inquisition, we're going on a bit of history over there. 1492 happened to be the 9th of Av, was the date designated for all Jews of Spain to leave the country. Obviously, there were horrors which the Jews experienced, obviously of the magnitude that one could hardly imagine. I think prior to 1956 there was no progressive Jewish congregation or reform movement in southern Rhodesia due to declining numbers. I think in 1977 the Salisbury congregation of Reform Jews would merge with the Orthodox congregation of other Ashkenazic Jews, I think who are Jews of France, Germany and Eastern Europe. And I think in 1935 with the general world depression, Rhodesia was affected, and in order to gainfully employ the population and create and find work for the income, the government forced every unemployed white male into work gangs or teams and paid them 5 shillings per day, plus board and food, if I'm not mistaken. It's a whole long article over here, so it's got a bit off, so I'm not going to continue the article in of itself. But yeah, I think they were very Zionistic, especially, I think it was in the year 1949, after the state was born of Israel, the Jewish communities of Rhodesia celebrated the first anniversary of Medinat Israel. They did great functions, festivities. There was a great Zionistic enthusiasm of the Rhodesians. Let's just say that was very similar to South African Jews, if I'm not mistaken. They did efforts to make Aliyah, and it would swell, especially in English-speaking numbers in Israel. And there was a vibrancy of life, will allow people to enjoy the freedom of life, leisure in this specific place in of itself. So that's something we had to point out. And yeah, very, very interesting. Okay, let's speak a bit more with regards to the community history. We're exploring the Jewish community history of Zimbabwe over here. So obviously we know that the history comes back from the British colonization period in the mid to late 1900s, as we spoke about beforehand. They were very Zionistic early on, especially. They established a Central African Zionistic organization in 1898 in Bulawayo, and yeah, very interesting. The number of Rhodesian members was about 400. It would significantly increase when the Sephardim came in. In 1943, the Rhodesian Jewish Board of Deputies and the Rhodesian Zionist Council were both formed to organize national Jewish and Zionistic activities in the country after the Second World War we mentioned about. Rhodesia experienced a period of economic prosperity that led the country to becoming a magnet for Jewish immigration at a point in time where people arrived from South Africa, United Kingdom. If I'm not mistaken, there was a Sephardic Jewish community synagogue was established in the 1950s in Salisbury, as we mentioned about before. Jews fleeing from the Belgian Congo began arriving in Rhodesia in the 1960s. Rhodesian Jews were among responsible for the development of the country's transportation system, as well as mining industries, we have to point out also. And this great success at that point in time was accompanied by high levels of, unfortunately, there was high levels of assimilation and intermarriage at that point in time, which is very sad to speak about. And I think the Federation of Rhodesia dissolved in 1964, if I'm not mistaken. By the late 1980s, the Zimbabwean Jewish community shrank to around 1,200 at that point in time. And the Jewish Board of Deputies is affiliated with the African Jewish Congress over there, based in South Africa, advocates on behalf of the small and scattered communities of the sub-Sahara Africa, if I'm not mistaken. Sam Benatar was a long-time president of Zimbabwe, the Jewish Board of Deputies, and was a vice president of the African Jewish Congress until he passed away in 2015. Jewish life in Zimbabwe was centered around Zimbabwe's Jewish Board of Deputies, we have to point out also. Religious, despite obviously its very small size now, there are still several functioning synagogues in Zimbabwe. The country's only rabbi, I think, as of recently, is Rabbi Nathan Asmocha, who operates out of the Bulawayo Hebrew Congregation Synagogue and Orthodox congregation, and I don't think kosher food is in plenty over there. It's quite more scarce. There's 2 Jewish day schools in Zimbabwe, Carmel in Bulawayo and Sharon in Herrera. They maintain open admission policies, educate Jewish children along with native students. B'nai Akiva, I think, is still an active youth organization over there. And Israel and Zimbabwe maintain diplomatic relations and trade ties. And Israel is represented by a non-resident ambassador based in based in Jerusalem. Now, a traveling rabbi of Zimbabwe is Moshe Silberhaft. There's an article in regards to him in 2011 that he was known as a traveling rabbi, and let's just say he doesn't describe himself as a pulpit rabbi. He insists, I'm an on-the-ground, hands-on ceremonial rabbi. and I'm as comfortable officiating weddings as exhuming cemeteries. I think Rabbi Silberhaft was African Jewish, or is maybe still, I'm not so sure his current status, the African Jewish Congress's country community head and spiritual leader to small congregations within sub-Saharan Africa. And as such, at this time of the article written in 2011, he has the largest congregation on the continent, 3,000 Jews in communities that stretch from Kenya to Cape Town and from Kinshasa to Madagascar. He divides his time traveling up between down Africa, thousands of miles each year, working in his office in Johannesburg. I think the Jewish Chronicle will actually give an article with regards to him, talking about him. And he actually states there's no difference to him between Zimbabwe and Mauritius, and it's people that count, he says. And I think he has a pathological desire to serve far-flung living communities and to physically commemorate the dead ones, let's just say in itself. Jobs are vital. These are to preserve Jewish identity and legacy. Roads and building in remote corners of Africa, once named after prominent local Jews, and he petitions to preserve them, or at least lay a plaque honouring their memory. So you can see this is a man that really honours Jewish heritage and culture in of itself. 80 years ago, the average resident in any small African town knew what a Jewish person was. Jewish urbanization and migration has diminished provincial communities in southern Africa. A second generation of Jewish settlers moved to the cities over there. And he has a passion, believing that local people need to know what Jews did for this region. So it's really trying to perpetuate the memory of the great personalities of yesteryear, uplifting the population around them, building schools, educating the wider community. And this article is very, very well detailed one in of itself. So I think he was a child born in Jerusalem. His parents moved to South Africa when he was 5 years of age. I think at that time they would move there to take care of a sick grandparent, and he would be learning in Yeshiva College, I think, in Johannesburg. When he was a teacher, he was sent out to small communities to help make a minyan. And very, very interesting enough, he actually remembers that he was in southern Africa, and he says there was no real need for a rabbi to officiate then, because there was many Jewish Lithuanian descent people that were very knowledgeable in Jewish rights in its own. After he went to college, he was conscripted into the South African Defence Force, reported over. He would serve as a chaplain to fellow Jewish soldiers, and he would travel while he was in the army to the farthest regions. Let's just say at that point in time, he would end his service in 1989, would go to Israel, would start his rabbinical training. He missed the release of Nelson Mandela's from prison, but returned in time to vote in South Africa's first truly democratic election, if I'm not mistaken. In 1903, he was named as the seventh head of the country communities department within South African Jewish Board of Deputies. He was an Orthodox minister, and and would really very pragmatic in itself with all his undertakings. Let's just say that the article goes on over there, and I think he was very well integrated within both the Sephardic and Ashkenazi communities. Would work in both communities, if I'm not mistaken. But I think it was reported over that Rabbi Silberhaft was sadly attacked by killer bees in Herrera while taking a Shabbat walk, if I'm not mistaken. This was between Ashkenazi and Sephardic communities, and would suffer from 87 stings on his head and back, and was rushed to hospital and administered on adrenaline at the time when this actually occurred, if I'm not mistaken. And he was working in places of extreme poverty, also pointed out. That's very, very interesting. Now there's another article from H.com website within regards to the Jewish community history of Zimbabwe. I think it's actually written, I'm not too sure who the author was and when it was written, but they talk about how the British South African Company in the late 1800s was headed by someone named Cecil Rhodes, would carve an enormous area of influence in Southern Africa. Named Rhodesia, it encompassed what today are the nations of Zambia in the north and Zimbabwe in the south. Let's say Jews, like other European settlers, began to pour into southern Africa in the late 1800s. There was a historian named Hugh Macmillan who actually says that these Jews were both economic migrants and refugees, escaping from the kind of religious and political persecution to the Russian Empire originally. Most of these immigrants went to South Africa But some more adventurous, let's say, settlers ventured further north into Rhodesia, where many worked as cattle traders over there. There's someone named Alfred Bates, who we mentioned about before, who was the founder of Rhodesia. Now, the article on H website says, no history of Rhodesia should fail to mention the remarkable generosity of Sir Alfred Bates, Cecil Rhodes, if I'm not mistaken. And I think a historian, Robert Blake, writes in his landmark work, A History of Rhodesia. Although Rhodesia was named after the famous British businessman and politician Cecil Rhodes, Rhodes' success was enabled by Alfred Bates, and Bates was one of the first Europeans to see business potential in southern Africa. Mr. Bates was born into a poor Jewish family in Germany in 1853. He started his working life with a firm that imported wool and diamonds industry in Holland. I think in 1875, I think Mr. Bates was sent to South Africa. He helped setting up a diamond mine over there. He realized that African diamonds were of much higher quality than any diamonds currently for sale in Europe, and he would start developing diamond mines and championing new mining techniques over there. A few years later, Mr. Bates met Cecil Rhodes, another diamond industry manager. Mr. Bates later recalled that Rhodes asked him if he ever took a rest. Not often, Mr. Bates replied. So you can see he was really, really hardworking. Rhodes explained his idea of launching a consolidated mining company to develop the region's mines, and Bates advanced him the £250,000 he needed for the venture with no security down. Now, Bates' gamble will pay off over there, and the British South African Corporation received its royal charter in 1889, with Bates helping to run, let's say, this massive venture over there. He was responsible for much of southern Africa's diamond industry development. His great passion, let's just say, was endowing, at that point in time, railroads and other infrastructures that developed in the region. And he endowed the Bates Trust before his death in 1966. And I think this fund still exists, which give grants to buildings and transportation infrastructure, if I'm not mistaken. And there's a website called the batestrust.org.uk, we have to point out. The Aish website also gives over a section saying the tents and frontier buildings, synagogues and Jewish life in Rhodesia. The first synagogue in what today is Zimbabwe was set up originally as a tent in what then was a remote town of Bulawayo. I think in 1894, 20 Jews came together to establish a place of worship in their new home. At that point in time, the following year, they established in Herrera, the Salisbury, and the third synagogue in 1901 in Gwelo. The smaller cities of Kadomo and Kwekwe were also home to Jewish communities. In 1898, the Bulawayo Jews set up a chapter of the Zionist organization Chovei Tzion. At that point in time, they helped express, let's say, their yearning for and to aid Jewish future state. In 1900, about 400 Jews lived in what was formerly called the Southern Rhodesia, and today is known as the independent nation of Zimbabwe. There's another article, From Rhodes to Rhodesia. The Greek island of Rhodes, which despite its name has no connection with Rhodesia, was home to a rich 3,000-year-old Jewish community. Many Jews, Rhodes, spoke Ladino and could trace their families' histories to Jewish expulsion from Spain in 1492. Now, in 1911, Rhodes came under Italian rule. The Jewish population at that time was about 4,000. There was a fascism gained, let's say, adherents, and particularly after Mussolini rose to power in 1938, most of Rhodes' Jews fled, and then become Rhodesia, known as Zimbabwe today. In 1931, the refugees established Sephardi Hebrew congregation in Herrera, Zimbabwe's capital. Sephardi Jewish immigrants also founded two of the most well-known shopping malls in Herrera at that point in time. There was someone named Sam Levy, a village, and the Avondale shopping centre. Sephardi Jews also set up textile mills and factories in their new homes. We mentioned about Mr. Hans Vandenberg just beforehand, who was a major player, let's just say, within regards to the textiles business, if I'm not mistaken. Zimbabwe's Jewish population peaked during the boom of the years following the Second World War. In 1961, it was more than 7,000 Jewish people living there. In 1964, Zambia, obviously known as the formerly Northern Rhodesia, declared independence. Southern Rhodesia remained a British colony until 1965. That year, the white supremacist leader Ian Smith declared independence for the Rhodesian government, and we did speak about this beforehand, if I'm not mistaken. Just reading this from the H website. Also, the H website would talk about Jewish roots among Christian and Muslim Africans with question mark. The Lemba are a southern African group that lives in Zimbabwe and South Africa, and apparently has long noted some similarities between traditions and Jewish practices. Lemba people do not eat pork, they observe a weekly holiday, and they even have a custom of carving stars that look like a Jewish symbol of the Star of David on their tombstones. They also speak a sacred language and has elements of Hebrew and Arabic, and likely was imported to Africa hundreds of years ago from ancestors in Yemen. Lemba people have long believed they are descended in part from Jewish visitors to Africa. I think recent genetic testing seems to support their claim of Jewish origins. Most of them currently are, let's say, Christian over here, and some are Muslim, if I'm not mistaken. Although the group used to be very close-knit and close to outsiders, in recent years, I think the younger Lemba people will marry non-Lembas, let's just say, in himself, and assimilated into wider Southern African culture, if I'm not mistaken. Very, very interesting. So, yeah. And the article on the H website actually concludes titling "A Tense Shabbat." Political turmoil in Zimbabwe continues, and the country's tiny Jewish community is determined to carry on as usual. Herrera's Jewish school did close briefly after President Mugabe was arrested, but then reopened as usual. At this stage, Shabbat services will still go ahead. I'm not sure when this was written, actually, this article, to be honest with you. And Rabbi Moshe Silberhaft, who we mentioned before, would actually state this in the African Jewish Congress, if I'm not mistaken. But everyone, this was a synopsis of the Jewish community history of Zimbabwe over here. So please, if any of you do descend from Zimbabwe, let me know. And don't forget, friends, subscribe to the channel. We're a community here where we're learning about the history of all the various different Jewish communities of the world. We're speaking about Zimbabwe beyond this edition. Don't forget to watch over the previous videos we recorded and share the videos, like the videos, and don't forget to subscribe also. Wishing all a Chodesh Tov, recording this at time of the Jewish New Month of Adar.